Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first international webinar at the FONDAP Center CRHIAM, the Water Research Center for Agricultural Mining at the University of Concepcion. And to me, it's a pleasure today to welcome everybody to this webinar entitled Monitoring Without a Framework, Up the Creek Without a Puddle. It will be a very interesting and vivid discussion this morning because I will like to thank my friend Kelly Munkichik, which is now in Calgary in Canada, is an adjunct professor from the Department of Biological Science at the University of Calgary in Canada, and is also member of the scientific committee of our center. The first time I met Kelly, it was almost 20 years ago at a CTAC meeting, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry meeting in Argentina. And he was giving a talk about what we should not do when we perform monitoring programs in aquatic ecosystems. And I realized that I was not doing so great in our monitoring work down here in Chile. So I decided to discuss with Kelly, and then he visited us many times. And when he was the director of the Canadian Rivers Institute, at that time at the University of New Brunswick, we decided to cooperate, and we really appreciate the help of Kelly to develop a better framework in our monitoring programs designed down here in Chile, in particular in the Biobío River, but in other rivers. He also played a big role in training a lot of Chilean students in these topics, and I really appreciate the help that Kelly has gave us over these almost 20 years that we have been cooperating, and now to discuss, this important issue of how do we monitor, the impacts of human activities on our aquatic ecosystem to make them more sustainable, but also to adapt, our monitoring framework to a more comprehensive way to understand how these complex ecosystems works. So thank you very much, Kelly, for joining us this morning, and I am sure that we will enjoy your discussion. And he is now more focused on developing adaptive, tiered, and triggered monitoring frameworks, a link in the different monitoring approach and philosophical foundations on an integrated management framework. So I will introduce you, Kelly, and he will present us a very short presentation, and the audience could write down in the chat to make questions that will be answered after the Kelly's presentation is done. So Kelly, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Muchas gracias. I wish that I could give my talk in Spanish, but I haven't been traveling down there nearly enough lately. Chile is a very important country for me, and the friendships and relationships that we've developed down there and the science we've done has been very rewarding. I will share my PowerPoint here. I think you can see it, hopefully.
Yes, yes.
I didn't know if the phrase "up the creek without a paddle" translates very well in Spanish. It's a
absolutely yes. Absolutely yes.
It's a very common saying that we have. I have moved around quite a bit. I started at the University of Calgary just in December of this year. And then, of course, COVID hit in March and slowed us all down. hang on, I have to get my slide working there. For people who aren't very aware about Canada, we are a very big country. This is a map on the right, shows the Chile is almost as long as Canada, but Canada, of course, is much wider. We have 6 time zones, I think. Yeah, 6 time zones, 5.5 time zones in Canada. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I'm currently at Alberta, which is over in Western Canada. So I have kind of a unique background. I started my career in the federal government, working in 2 federal departments as a research scientist. And then I went down to the University of New Brunswick, where we formed the Canadian Rivers Institute. And then I took 5 years off and worked for industry with the oil sands industry here, and working with 17 of the companies to try and help them build a framework for their monitoring. And then I went to another university in Eastern Canada and helped design some monitoring frameworks for the Northwest Territories. And now at Calgary, we're trying to set up a Center for Environmental Monitoring Expertise. Kind of research that I do goes out into river systems and tries to identify when a system is under stress, and then tries to understand what is causing that stress and how to fix it. We've done a lot of international work in countries, and you'll notice that most of these, Cuba, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, in February and January, when it's very cold here, it's very warm there. So it's a much nicer place to work in our wintertime. A lot of what we do is trying to focus the impact assessment techniques on processes for decision makers around environmental management, and then find a way to more effectively use the monitoring that goes on. For people, I'm sure you're familiar with the research network there, and the vision and objectives of the network, creating networks to benefit interest in research, innovation, development, and water resources, and contributing to better water management through communication and dissemination of scientific evidence that contributes to public policies and knowledge of society. And that's very much the kind of work that we're involved in. I read a couple papers last week on water governance issues in Chile, just to refresh my mind on the situation there and what's happening and the directions you're trying to go is very similar to what's going on in Canada. A need to move to adaptive management instead of rigorous legislation, trying to use watershed-based approach instead of national approaches, and trying to deal with the issues in ecosystems within a socioeconomic context. And lots of challenges, jurisdictions fragmented, there's not good communication, there's not good coordination, and there's not a good framework for decision making. When I worked with the oil sands companies here in Alberta, they did $180 million a year in monitoring, and most of the data was never looked at, and almost none of it was used for any decision making. So there's 11 different types of monitoring that aren't very well coordinated. For existing facilities, they have 5 basic types of monitoring that they do. Compliance monitoring that deals with the regulatory process. What we have in Canada is something called environmental effects monitoring. They do performance monitoring. They have to monitor if they have any crises or spills. And if they're doing mitigation to try and correct problems or to recover ecosystems, then they need to do that monitoring. Proposed developments have 3 different types of monitoring: environmental impact assessment, environmental risk assessment, and cumulative effects assessment. And governments have 3 types of monitoring: baseline assessments, status and trends assessment, and a new type of monitoring that we call cumulative effects monitoring. So there's 11 different types of monitoring. The challenge is that there's no common framework, philosophy, methodology, or linkages. All 11 types report to different parts of the governments, and so there's no common regulatory basis. So the situation in Canada is if you're going to develop a mine, the monitoring you do before construction goes to one government department or one part of a department. What you do during construction goes to another, and what you go after construction and when you're operating goes to still another. And so the frameworks that we're working on are trying to merge those into a common process. We hear lots today about cumulative effects assessment, and it's one of my irritations because all effects are cumulative. When you monitor organisms in the environment, they're showing a response to everything that they are being exposed to. There's three approaches when you go in to do some monitoring. There's a stressor-based approach, which asks, what are the main threats to the system? There's a values-based approach. How do I protect what I want out of the system? And there's an effects-based approach, which are the things that live in the basin happy? And a lot of processes are moving towards effects-based approach. Another challenge with monitoring is why people monitor. It's very common for governments to have water quality monitoring and water quantity monitoring approaches, where they go out and they collect the same data every year at the same sites, but nobody really knows what to do with that data in many cases. So we need a structured, regional, coordinated approach. One of the challenges is to make the monitoring actionable so that people can take the monitoring results and actually do them, and that the monitoring will contribute to identifying, understanding, and resolving any issues and concerns. So a regional monitoring framework will give a consistent approach in terms of sampling strategy, endpoints, and protocols, such that monitoring efforts become more coordinated, approaches become standardized for related components, data becomes regionally available, and you get answers to key questions in terms of definition of causes and potential solutions to problems. Since about 1990, Canada has an industry-funded environmental effects monitoring program that has tiers of monitoring that adapt the frequency and intensity of monitoring based on the level of concern. And the EEM questions focus monitoring to give you actionable results. So the Canadian Environmental Effects Monitoring Program is what we call a tiered program. If you think of layers on a cake, the bottom layer is a surveillance layer, which asks, are there changes? If you see changes and they're big enough that you're concerned, it triggers a confirmation process. If you confirm that they're there and they're big enough that you're concerned, you go to a focused monitoring program, which looks at how far downstream and how things change. If it's a big enough area and that you're concerned enough, then you go to something called investigation of cause. And then the top layer of the birthday cake is the investigation of solutions. A third challenge with monitoring is what's normal. You can see that picture on the left that I haven't changed very much since I started my graduate degree. This map at the bottom is Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes, which is in central Canada. At the western end of Lake Ontario down here, you zoom in and you see Hamilton. There were two big steel mills that employed about 40,000 people and discharged their effluent into this bay at the end that was cut off from Lake Ontario by a sand spit. The lab that I did my master's in was a fish cancer lab. In Hamilton Harbor, there should have been 50 or 60 species of fish. There were only 3 abundant species, and all 3 had cancer. This is a catfish, a brown bullhead with a lip tumor and a skin tumor. And you can see its whiskers are burnt from the PAHs. This is a carp with a gonadal tumor. This is a liver tumor from a sucker. So one of the challenges with monitoring is to try and understand sustainability. And so Kelly defines sustainability as, we want the next generation to get an environment at least as good or bad as the current one. I can't control how we got where we are. The best I can do is keep what we have for future generations. But it's not acceptable to only have 3 abundant species when there should be more than 50. And so it's very important when you're doing monitoring to separate the concepts of sustainability and acceptability. Restoration is a question of acceptability. If you want to have 50 species back in that harbor, you have to do some restoration and fix some of the problems. But sustainability is related to degradation. We don't want future generations to only get 2 species of fish. We want to try and at least preserve what we have and then make progress back to what we would want. So the priority has to be to stop degradation and then consider restoration. And the study designs to look at those issues are very different. Another challenge with monitoring is, when is a change real? This is a picture of a white sucker, a female. She's been opened up as she's coming up to spawn, and intestines have been removed, and these are the ovaries. And this is at a reference site on Lake Superior where there's no permanent residents. And this is the size of the ovaries as a percentage of body weight over a 30-year time period. So if these standard error bars don't overlap, there's a statistical difference. But if we take the mean and 2 standard deviations of this 30-year data set, this clean site doesn't go outside of that 2 standard deviations. And that's what we call the normal range. And so when we're doing monitoring, you see lots of statistical differences, but for us, unless it goes outside the normal range, we don't think it's a very meaningful difference. And so when we design our monitoring programs, we certainly focus when there is a statistical difference, but we worry if there's a difference that is outside of normal range. One of the things we've worked a lot on is how to estimate what that normal range is. So this is from the 30-year data set. This is 25 years of that data. This is the condition factor in fish. It's basically their body mass index, so how fat they are. And we can get a normal range on that because we have 25 years of data. But if we look at the individual years of data, the lower end of the 95% confidence interval bounces around. So what we can do is we can actually get a 95% confidence interval on a 95% confidence interval. And if I take this and stand it upright, what I get is an inner and outer tolerance limit for what's normal. And so, oh geez, I thought the next slide was an example of that, but it's not. And so that allows us to make an estimate of the normal range. What we do with that normal range is we develop monitoring triggers. And so these are the tiers of monitoring, and our triggers to move from surveillance to confirmation is your outside of natural variability. If you confirm that and your reference site is adequate, then you go to extend in magnitude. Once you understand that, if it's a big enough area, then you go to investigation of cause. And then if it becomes ecologically relevant, you go to investigation of solutions. So that's what we call a tiered and triggered monitoring program. So you start out in surveillance. If you see things, you increase the intensity of monitoring. If you don't see things, you can reduce the intensity of monitoring and skip cycles of monitoring. So there's a bunch of different ways that we've worked on in terms of how do we calculate these normal ranges. And if you're interested, you can send Ricardo an email and I can get you some papers related to that. In 2006, when we were working on our St. John River projects, when I was at the University of New Brunswick, a paper came out on the impedance of cumulative effects assessment in Canada. And what they said in their paper, they said that monitoring and development assessments weren't being very successful. And the main suggestion of the paper focuses on fundamental changes in how cumulative effects assessment is carried out. They wanted to turn it into regional environmental assessment and regional environmental effects frameworks that might best be interpreted as technical assessment components of regional land use planning processes. When we read this paper, we had a major study that had been going on in the St. John River, and we had more than 115 graduate student projects looking at the health of the river. 4 major new developments happened. They didn't use any of our data in their environmental impact assessments. And so we approached these 2 scientists to ask why what we did was so useless for what they did. If we look at the environmental effects monitoring program, this is an example. In this case, someone's going out and monitoring something every 3 years. The green is the range of normal variability, so it's bouncing around. When it goes outside of normal, that increases the intensity of monitoring. So rather than going every 3 years, you go the next year. If it was an expected change, you can develop a new normal range. If it was an unexpected change, or it continues to get worse, that's what we call a concern. So here in this diagram, I've got 3 different triggers: a monitoring trigger, which changes how often I monitor; a forecast trigger, so if I built a sewage treatment plant, I might predict that the amount of phosphorus in the river would go up. I could make that prediction and I could make a forecast. I could put this variability around that forecast, and then I would know if it went up what I predicted it would go up. An unexpected increase, or increase that continues to get worse or worse than expected, triggers the investigation of cause. And at the top here, we have a management trigger, which is defined by some sort of government land use planning process. And so what that paper was asking for was to move monitoring into a technical assessment component of a regional land use planning process. So the challenges with monitoring, I'm almost done the challenges. How do you integrate an adaptive system? So there's other types of triggers other than just a monitoring trigger. There's management triggers, which are limits of change developed through regional land use planning processes that define the maximum amount of change that will be acceptable. There's compliance triggers, which are limits developed through a regulatory process that places limits on withdrawals or discharges, within limits set through a regional modeling process. Performance triggers, which limit facility, or limits on facility operational parameters developed through an environmental impact assessment or development approval process. And forecast triggers, which are limits developed for a watershed that integrate the predicted impacts of development within the regional modeling process that allow the determination of whether pre-development goals for environmental protection are achieved. So monitoring triggers for an environmental effects monitoring program are the engine that drives the integrated system. They provide the foundation, the framework, the methodology, and the linkages to drive a common regulatory and planning framework. Data from the monitoring program feeds directly into the forecast trigger, did we predict correctly, and into management triggers through the regional land use planning processes that tell us how close we are to the acceptable level of change that we'll accept in the system. So an integrated regional monitoring and modeling framework moves us towards adaptive management instead of rigorous legislation, towards a watershed-based approach, and towards linkages of the ecosystem to other decision-making contexts. And it aligns jurisdiction. It provides focus and clear communication for areas of concern. It provides for coordination across groups, and it gives a transparent framework for decision-making. And as you can see from this picture, moving towards an integrated regional tiered and triggered adaptive monitoring framework gives us the paddle that we need for our canoe. And I'll stop there. I'll be happy to take some questions.
Yes, thank you very much for your inspiring words. And I was thinking that probably the experience you have in Canada may be useful for some of the challenge that we are facing here in terms of this concept that we as CRHIAM has embraced, which is the water security concept, you know, in terms that how can we ensure that we will have, you know, sustainable water supply, but also use of this limited resource in this context of climate change. So I have some questions, and I can take questions also from the audience, you know. And the first question I have, Kelly, is related to the barriers for implementing this kind of integrated approaches. So what are the main barriers you have faced in Canada to adapt and adopt this monitoring framework?
Well, there's no shortage of barriers. In Canada, responsibility for water management is spread across 25 federal departments as well as provincial agencies, all that have their own approach and their own opinion. And so trying to find pilot projects where you can get people to get experience. Alberta, where I'm living now, is one of the few provinces that actually has regional land use planning processes based on watersheds. Their modeling is focused on regional modeling, but what we want in this integrated framework is site-specific modeling, and trying to get people to adapt and change the way they've always done things as government is very challenging. So it's a very slow process to get people into the conversation.
Okay, and then when you try to promote this more wider view of how the different kind of monitoring is performed at the basin level, you mentioned that you prefer a kind of adaptive management rather than a rigorous legislation. Could you give some more insights on that? Because in Chile, we usually try to change the regulations in order to keep moving, you know, and sometimes it will be some limiting factor for achieving sustainability, in my view. But what is your opinion on that?
Well, what I found so I worked in government developing regulations, and it's a really slow process. And I worked in industry, and if you're working with good companies, when they see problems and they're convinced that they're important problems, they can move very quickly to deal with them. And so there's no doubt that some companies need some sort of a hammer or a stick to hit them with, but good companies will work. They don't want to, you know, big companies have thousands or tens of thousands of employees, many of which are also environmentalists. And so big companies don't want to be seen to be hurting the environment. And so if you get good partners, you can move much more quickly. If you can get industry and public stakeholders and First Nations to agree on what should be done, the government generally won't stand in their way. But it's getting people focused. It was one of my big challenges working in industry, was teaching them that they needed to see monitoring. They needed to get very sensitive monitoring. Because if an industry goes out and monitors and they don't see anything, people don't believe them. They say you didn't look hard enough. So the only success is to see small change that isn't very meaningful. So you have to look very hard and see things, and then work on the discussion that it's a small change. We don't think it's important, but we're going to track it. But if you go out and monitor and don't see anything, people don't believe you.
Yeah, we are having some questions from the audience online here. And Jennifer asked about the how the measurement of the water footprint help in these models of basin management.
Well, they would go into the modeling component. So one of the important part is and one of the main things we're trying to do is to link modeling and monitoring in a feedback way, that when your model doesn't predict what you see monitoring, you have to remodel. And when your monitoring doesn't predict what you see in modeling, you have to adjust your monitoring to make sure you're looking in the right way. And so linking the modeling and the monitoring in a tight way improves both, so that you continuously get better.
Okay, thanks. There is another question from Leopoldo, which is a colleague at the CRHIAM Center. Thanks, Kelly, for your excellent presentation. Have a question: what kind of monitoring is it done to water that comes from the oil sand processing plants?
So the oil sands are unique. As I mentioned, the companies spend about 180 million a year monitoring. Since they started developing in the 1960s, they have not been allowed to discharge any water. So any water that they use in the process, any water that comes out of the bitumen, any water that falls on their site, has to be stored in tailings ponds. And I'm currently chairing a science team that's composed of government, industry, and First Nations reps, which is looking at what the requirements might be if people would consider to return that water. So every other type of mine or pulp mill or industry in Canada is allowed to discharge treated water. The oil sands are not. So they have these giant tailings ponds that keep getting bigger and bigger because they've had to store all of their water since the 1960s.
My God. So, well, sometimes regulatory decisions cause, I mean, not what they intended at the when they were established, you know, sometimes.
So the reason they didn't want them discharging was that they wanted them to recycle the water. Okay. And the problem is, if you recycle water over and over and over again, it gets saltier and saltier. And so it will become a challenge for reclamation when they go to close the sites, that their water will be too salty.
So I wonder, Kelly, what is the role of the community in this framework that you are proposing, and in terms of participation? I mean, how the community could be involved in that process of monitoring, being part of the monitoring, or being part of the information that this monitoring should deliver to the society?
Yeah, so there's three ways. One is through the setting of the management triggers. So there's a public stakeholder involvement process in land use planning, where they get to help set the vision for what they want the basin to look like. There's also a participation possible through the development of approval process, where stakeholders can place objections to that process. The other component that we have is community-based monitoring. And so, especially in our northern areas, there's a large indigenous population, and there's a lot of effort now to try and allow them to participate in the monitoring, as well as design their own monitoring that they think is important. And so one of the triggers that is missed in the framework that I talked about, and one that we're working on actively now, is how to set indigenous use triggers that would also be part of the management process. So that's an area of research we're still doing.
Okay. And then we have another question from our audience now. Thanks for the presentation, Abril Bernales. I would like to ask, which is the monitoring frequency generally used for the surveillance objective?
Yeah, so that's going to really depend on what the aspect is. For air monitoring, we have some continuous monitoring. For some components of water, we have continuous monitoring. Generally, when we start biological monitoring, what we'd like to do is to go annually for the first 3 years. Once you get 3 years of data, you can set an estimate for the normal range, because you have 3 years, you can do a standard deviation. And we use as a first estimate 2 standard deviations for that normal range. It actually takes about 8 cycles of data to get a good picture of the normal range. So some components, once you've got your baseline data, are every 3 years. Things like forest health is every 6 years. So it really depends on how quick you think things will change. But it also becomes very important to make sure, if you're only going once or twice a year, to make sure you go at the right time for the animals that you're looking at.
Okay, there is another question, more or less in the same direction, which is in those catchments that are dominated by agricultural use, and you want to monitor pesticides. So how do you face that situation?
Yeah, one of the challenges is and it's one of the reasons I mentioned there's stressor-based, values-based, and effects-based. Kelly's preference is to go out and monitor the organisms. And so when we went into our potato farming area to do a study, we didn't look at the herbicides and the pesticides and the fungicides. We looked at the fish and said, are you unhappy? And then we let their level of unhappiness direct us to where the issues were coming from. And trying to separate whether it's a pesticide, a herbicide, or a fungicide, or it's sediment, or it's changing temperature, or it's changing flow, becomes really, really complicated. And so you can spend a lot of money trying to monitor the levels of pesticides, and you may be missing what the real issue is. So there are pesticide monitoring programs. They're usually an annual one, but our preference is to do the effects-based work and to look at the animals to see, if you ask them what they think the problem is, they will take you to it.
Yeah, another question from Anita. To face these extreme events, you know, we are facing a mega drought over the last 12 years or so. What elements should be considered to approach as a good model for basin management?
Yeah, so I mentioned the paper that I showed by Peter Dunker and Lauren Gregg on the impedance of cumulative effects assessment. We went into a 3-year research project with them to try and understand how to make our monitoring more useful to people that were doing assessments. What we came out of at the end of that process was a recognition that we were monitoring the wrong way. If you go to your physician takes your blood pressure or your cholesterol or your triglycerides, and they compare what your level is to what would be normal for your age and gender. So your physician actually tells you you're healthy if there's an absence of signs that you're sick. So all of the monitoring we were doing, I mentioned in the St. John River, we had 115 graduate students. They were all looking at what were signs of sickness. if you take an 8-month-old to the physician, they don't take its blood pressure. They say you're in the 85th percentile for the length and weight you should be at this age. And so it's a performance-based assessment. And so where we got to at the end of that monitoring was we needed to understand what drove natural variability so that we could make a prediction. So for one example, in agricultural streams and forested streams in New Brunswick, there's a tiny fish called a slimy sculpin. We know that in the 1st of September, this year's babies should be between 25 and 45 millimeters long. That's the equivalent of saying your blood pressure should be 120/80. Mm. When we did enough streams, we could actually model the size based on water temperature. So within the healthy range, if your water was 17 degrees this summer, you should be between 32 and 35 millimeters. So we can make a prediction of what it should be based on this year's climate, and then we can go out and test whether our observed matches are predicted. And that allows you to start monitoring health instead of monitoring sickness. That's a long way to say these extreme events, we used to not like them. Now we do like them, because what we want is to understand, rather than monitoring things that don't change, we want things that look different in good years and bad years. And what extreme events allow us to do is to extend our modeling to make better predictions around extreme events. And so that's part of the linking modeling and monitoring more tightly that allows the extreme events to improve both your modeling and your monitoring. If that makes sense.
It's in some way that means that we should change our paradigm as
Absolutely.
we face this monitoring challenge, you know.
Yeah.
Well, Kelly, thank you very much. We are approaching the end of this webinar. I think that you give us some inspiring ideas to continue. I mean, that need further up development. But I would like to just a final think or thought. What you be your advice, having, I mean, the knowledge that you have about Chilean regulatory or Chilean ecosystems, what would be your advice to improve our monitoring design and our monitoring framework?
It's trying to get people into, all groups into the conversation. It takes 5 to 8 years to build trust across groups. And so you need to get everybody trying to work together. The environmental groups, the indigenous groups, the public stakeholders, the industry, the government, and the researchers all have to be in a place where they trust each other and that they can design things together. And so it's a slow process. It takes 5 to 8 years to build trust, and it takes 30 seconds to lose it. So you just need to be patient and try and work together and try and share data.
Okay, so thank you very much, Kelly, for sharing your thoughts with us this morning, and that for sure, I mean, give us some interesting ideas, food for thought in the forthcoming time, and these difficult times, even, you know, with this pandemic affecting us, and for sure affecting also how do we monitor, you know, our in this case, our aquatic ecosystems. So thank you, the audience which is joining us this morning, who joined us this morning, and you, Kelly, for giving some part of your time, your busy time, to share your thoughts with us.
It was my pleasure.